I just bought the A7R II. This is an incredible camera and I'm going to show you exactly why it's so incredible. So I've been using this crop frame Sony A6000 for the last 2 years. It's been my workhorse and I love it. It's a great camera, really recommend it, especially for the price point, sub £500. Great camera. But now I've moved up in the world. The A7R II full frame camera. Is it worth the extra image quality? Well, this is what I want to find out. I really need to satisfy my need for knowing that I'm not wasting my money on this camera and it's actually worth the extra over this one. By the way, I'm going to get a bit technical because it's going to satisfy my needs to finding the right answers about whether this camera is actually better than this one or I'm just wasting my money. First of all, let's just quickly compare some specs. So this camera here, the A6000, has a crop sensor 24 megapixel camera. The A7R II has full frame, so you'll notice it's bigger. A new type of sensor called BSI, backside illuminated, and it's 42 megapixels, so more megapixels and a new updated type of sensor, and a bigger sensor. So does that actually make a difference on the image quality? That's something we're going to look into. This one has an AA filter, also known as an Anti Aliasing filter, whereas this one doesn't. Now, does that actually matter? Does that make a difference? Well, I'm going to look into that and we'll find an interesting answer actually. 12-bit RAW, 14-bit RAW, what does that mean? Does that make a difference? Well, we're going to look into that. So looking at these cameras, this one's obviously smaller and going to be light. This is about 350 grams. This one's bigger and heavier at about 650 grams. So there's a bit of a difference there. So that's a quick overview of kind of the main differences. Let's dig a bit deeper now. So let's go into the first thing I want to talk about, and that is the sensor itself and the type of sensor, this BSI sensor. What's all that about? Looking at the A6000, forgetting the fact that it's a crop sensor, it's the sensor design we're looking at. It's a traditional front side illuminated design, whereas this is backside illuminated. What does that mean? Well, if you look at the image I'm putting up, you'll see that on the left hand side, the light to get through to the photo receiving layer has to get through some like wire and other layers and stuff, and it just means it not as much light is actually going to reach the actual sensor part. Whereas looking at on the right hand side with the BSI sensor, you'll notice that all the wiring and all that kind of stuff, the light doesn't have to travel through because if it's been designed differently. It should hit straight onto the sensor, no kind of having to take a longer route, therefore you're going to collect more light, which is a good thing. It's a great thing, isn't it? So that's kind of the design difference, but what does that mean in the real world? You know, we can spout numbers all day, but what we need to do is actually look at something that's going to show us a difference. So what I'm going to do is compare this traditional design sensor against the BSI sensor, but I'm not going to use this one. I'm actually going to use the sensor in this RX100 Mark III, which I'm recording with, because it's a smaller sensor. It's 1 inch, so it's smaller than this crop sensor, but it is a BSI sensor. So it'd be interesting to see if ISO wise it's going to hold up. Here's the image I took with the A6000, first at the base ISO of 100, and compare that to the Sony RX100 Mark III at base ISO, which is about 80, I think. I've turned off all the noise reduction that Capture One applies, and also set the white balance the same. Their base ISOs, they're going to look fine, but let's whack them up to ISO 3200 on both of them and see what the difference is. And you can tell from looking at these that the difference is barely anything. They look pretty good, don't they? Which is pretty amazing to me, considering we're comparing a 1 inch sensor to crop sensor. So a smaller sensor design to a bigger sensor, and they're doing as well as each other. So imagine that technology in a full frame sensor. The noise is going to be pretty low compared to this. So, I mean, that's a tick for the A7R2, isn't it? Surely. Next thing I want to look at is this AA filter, Anti Aliasing filter. Now, what's that about? Well, basically, it's a filter they put in cameras to reduce high frequency noises. What we mean by that is, looking at this picture, you can see that there's this, what were they called? Not moire, as in there's Ray and more of him, but moire. I think that's how you pronounce it. Moire? Moire. Anyway, it's just there to help reduce that weird look. The negative effect of that is it actually reduces the sharpness of an image. So for landscape photography, losing sharpness isn't a good thing, but it'd be interesting to compare how much sharpness we're actually going to lose by having this AA filter. So put a little test together, shot out my window here looking out over the housing estate, and I've compared the AA filter, the 24 megapixel sensor with the AA filter of the A6000 with the, I'm going to put this in crop mode to make it fair, and crop mode on the A7R2 is about 18 megapixels. So in comparison, we're going to have 6 megapixels less out the Sony A7R2, but we've got no AA filter. So if the image, even though it's got less megapixels, is going to be sharper than this, then it just shows that the AA filter is really reducing the quality of the image. So let's have a look. So just to make this fair as possible, I've used the same settings on each camera, the same settings in Capture One. I've even used the same lens, this Sony 18-105, aperture of f8, the same focal length, and I've tried to frame them the same as much as possible. So I'm trying to make this as fair as possible. So let's go and have a look at what we get. So here's our images in Capture One. Zooming in straight away, we can tell the A7R2 has more contrast, less haze, and the edges just look sharper straight away. Moving around to these flags down here that someone's handily left hanging in a garden, which is nice, we can see that again the A7R2 just has that nice pop to it with contrast, sharper, and just more detailed, more defined edges. And don't forget, this has got, in crop mode, the A7R2 is 6 megapixels less than the 24 megapixel A6000. So considering that, it's doing a cracking job. And finally, I thought this would be interesting to show you, because even though the image is sharper with the A7R2, if we look at the number plate on this car over here, we can see that that extra 6 megapixels on the A6000 just makes it that bit easier to read the number plate on that car. In fact, I don't think, looking at the A7R2 image, I'd be able to even work out what the letters and numbers are. So that's just a little side point there I thought I'd bring out. So after looking at them images, does the AA filter make a difference? Well, yes it does, a massive difference in my opinion. So much of a difference, in fact, I'd say it's like putting glasses on for the first time when you start to lose your sight. It's that much, it's night and day clearer how much of a difference not having an AA filter makes. So that is another tick for the A7R2. Next thing we want to look at is megapixels, 24, 42. Does that make an actual difference? Well, I think we know the answer here. We know more megapixels is going to make a difference, but let's look at it anyway. So going back to the image where we last finished with the previous test, let's bring in the full frame version of this image and see how much difference that makes to the image quality compared to the 24 megapixel A6000. Again, here I've set everything the same. The only difference this time is I've had to use a different lens, the Sigma 24-105, as that covers the full frame sensor. And straight away, looking at this number plate, we can easily read it with the A7R2. Looking down at these flags, they look way sharper, more defined, great contrast and clarity, just looks so much better. And going back to the TV aerial, we can see just so much more detail in the aerial itself. And looking behind the aerial at the trees, they have a bit more of a defined edge to them. And again, contrast and the clarity is just that much better on it. So you combine them extra megapixels with the lack of an AA filter, and boy does that make a difference. That is the real killer difference with this camera. No AA filter, more megapixels, just sharper, more contrast, more clarity, just better images. Tick for the A7R II. Next thing we want to look at is the dynamic range. When we talk about dynamic range, what we mean is the brightest white to the darkest black, and that would be our dynamic range. But given the scene, given the time of day, it's going to be different in every case. So think of a sunset or sunrise. We've got the bright sun coming down in our image, really bright. That's going to be the brightest point. And in contrast to that, the land is going to be very dark. So that's going to be our darkest blacks down there. So that's going to be a very wide dynamic range. Compare that to midday on an overcast day, everything's evenly lit. There's going to be very small difference between the brightest point and the darkest point, so we're going to have quite a small dynamic range. But one of the interesting things we need to talk about before we get into the actual dynamic range of the cameras is the bit depth. 12-bit, 14-bit, does that make a difference? And what's that to do with dynamic range? Well, let's talk about that. 12-bit, 14-bit, what's that all about? Well, basically it's a difference in the amount of colour information that is stored in each pixel. So the more bits, the more colour values are going to be stored for each pixel. 12-bit on the A6000, that's going to store about 4,000 different colours for each pixel. 14-bit on the A7R II is going to store 16,000 different colours for each pixel. So that's like 4 times the amount of colour values for each pixel. So where bit depth really helps is when it comes to dynamic range. How's that? Well, let me tell you. Bit depth is primarily about how much information in your camera's dynamic range can be retained. And this comes down to one thing. RAW files work in a linear way, not logarithmic. No, I didn't get that either. So let me explain. Basically, half those color values for each pixels are used for the very brightest first stop of light in your RAW file. Then the next stop is going to take the next quarter of the values. Then the next stop after that is going to be the next eighth, and so on and so on and so on. But basically what you need to know is the extra 14-bit over 12-bit means that the Sony A7R II is going to be able to retain more dynamic range information, which means it's going to have more dynamic range to work with. So that's a great thing. But what does that actually relate to in real life? What does that mean? Well, let's have a look. So if we look at the DxOMark scores for these cameras, we're going to see that the A7R II has 0.8 more dynamic range than the A6000. 0.8, you say? That's amazing. But what does that mean? What does that mean, 0.8? It's just a number. Well, I've put together a little test. Calm down. I've put together a little test that's going to help us see the actual real difference of that 0.8 and what it means for landscape photography. If we go back to the previous shots, looking out my window, I took some more of those, but this time -4 and -5 stops below the correct exposure. Why did I do that? Well, to test anything, you've got to take it to its limit. So the fact that I'm really underexposing these images, when we put them in Capture One and when we bring up the exposure again to correct it, we're going to see how much noise there is, what the colour difference is, how much detail has been retained in those shadows. So this will be an interesting one. Let's have a look. So comparing the -4 exposures at first and then bringing the exposures right up again, we can immediately see that straight away the A7R II colours just very close to where they should be, whereas the A6000 on the other hand is this green tint to it. And don't forget, I've set the white balance the same, so this green tint has to do with the information that the sensor's captured. Looking at the TV aerial as we zoom in here, in the center of the image, the quality difference is pretty impressive. The A6000 looks noisy, looks hazy, lacks contrast, and it's just not a lot of detail. But looking at the A7R II on the other hand, it just looks sharp, doesn't it? Only a little noise and good contrast, and it really, I would say, a usable image. Really, it's quite amazing. Let's go and compare the other one, the -5 underexposed images. Again, here the A6000 just has a massive colour shift towards green. But also again, the A7R II looks great. TV aerial is starting to lose detail. Just a lot of noise, and it's really a useless image. You wouldn't even bother keeping it for a thumbnail, would you? The A7R II, on the other hand, yeah, it's got more noise than the previous image I took with it, and it's starting to lose more detail. But it's just night and day. It's just crazy how much difference, how much better the A7R II is over the A6000. So it's pretty obvious how much better the A7R II is doing over the A6000. The fact that you can underexpose that much means, you know, those times you accidentally get the exposure wrong on an image, or you want to pull up the shadows a bit more, you don't have to fear, because you know you can have confidence that that image is still going to look great when you push the exposure up again. So it's a really powerful tool we have here, and you know, giving me confidence doing this test in how good a camera this is. Really blown away so far. Now I've set another little test up, but it's just really an extreme test. I'm not expecting anything amazing out of these cameras, but I thought it'd be interesting just how far you could push these cameras. So this one's really about pushing the dynamic range to the extreme. And this image here is just to show you the setup. You'll notice it's got an LED light that is set to its lowest setting in front of a curtain. We've got a bit of daylight creeping in, and I've got my guitar on the wall, which is in deep shadow, and that's going to show us how much detail is retained when we bring up the exposures again. So in these images here, I've exposed for the LED light, so really underexposed this image. As you'll notice, we can see detail in the LED light. The guitar's disappeared, and we can see a bit of daylight coming through. Now, pulling up the exposure as much as we can, let's just see how much data the camera's managed to capture. Obviously, neither of these images are usable, but it's just going to help us demonstrate the power of the A7R II. Looking at the guitar, we can see how much more detail on the A7R II than the A6000 has. I mean, the A6000's barely starting to reveal the guitar. And zooming in, there's just crazy noise there on the A6000. But the A7R II is pretty respectable, I think, the amount of noise there for how underexposed it is. There's a decent amount of detail, and the colours aren't that crazy off from what they should be. It's interesting to note the LED light and how the cameras have dealt with that sudden difference in light and dark. So see how the A6000 has this roll off from the bright light, giving it like this halo effect to the shadows behind. Compare that to the A7R II, and we can see how well it really deals with such a dramatic jump. We've got no halo effect, and it just makes the image look more natural and not extreme like the A6000 image does. So this is probably due to that extra colour bit depth we were talking about earlier, that extra bit depth containing more information in the highlights. So I think with that extreme test, we've really proven that the A7R II is a workhorse when it comes to dynamic range. So dynamic range, A7R II, tick. So the next thing we want to look at, which, you know, is a more subjective thing, and that is of colour. Looking at the DxO mark, we can see again the DxO mark rates the A7R II as having 26 bits compared to 24, I think it is. So if we go back to the previous pictures we compared, the ones that are correctly exposed looking out my window, but this time looking at the colour difference, It seems to me personally that the A7R II recreates the tones more naturally as I see them out the window, and I know this because I went out and checked them against what I saw on the screen. So that's one of the advantages of doing one of these tests at home. In no way was this colour test scientific. It's just very subjective, I think, but personally to me I think the colours on the A7R II are better, so another tick for the A7R II. So in conclusion then, I'm extremely impressed by the capabilities of the A7R II. I mean, I thought this was the bee's knees after using it for 2 years. I mean, I've taken some great pictures with this. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still a great camera. I still love it. I won't let you go. It's still mine. But we're going to move on to the big boys now. The Sony A7R II. Just better dynamic range, better colour, better sharpness, better clarity, just better. I'm sorry, but we have a new king, and his name is A7R II. Talking about megapixels, well, yeah, I was quite happy with 24 megapixels. I didn't really see a need for any more, but having 42 megapixels, that's nice. That is a nice bonus. I'm not going to complain about that. It means you can crop in, you can be a bit more creative, you can print bigger. You know, it does have its advantages, and I mean, its real advantage is going to be to the sharpness of the image at the end of the day. That's the real advantage there. So that is a nice bonus, and I'm not going to complain about that, but that's not really why I got the camera. The reason I got this was because of its performance, to do with dynamic range, to do with colour, and to do with noise levels, the fact that I can underexpose and bring it back up and basically lose no quality in the image. So that's what I really wanted rather than the megapixels. The megapixels just a nice bonus to me. So some side notes about the cameras themselves. I mean, I've only had this a few days so far, but the first thing I noticed was just compared to the A6000 was the image quality on the screen here and in the viewfinder, just that much better, which made it easier to focus and compose my images, which, you know, is a real handy thing to have when you're shooting landscapes. That's what you need, so that is a great bonus feature. So what about size and weight? Well, I mean, it's obviously bigger than this thing and therefore heavier, and also because you've got a bigger framed sensor, you're going to need bigger glass on the front, which again is going to make it bigger, it's going to make it heavier. Is that a bad thing? No, I mean, it's not that heavy to me. For 99% of the time, it's not going to be a problem, because I'm only going to be walking like 20-30 minutes. It's only if I go hiking or camping or something, I'm going to be taking loads of stuff for a long time, then it's a problem. But then I've got this guy to fall back on, so it's not a bad thing. Pros and cons, there we go. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this information I put together. It certainly helped me learn a lot about this camera that I just got, and also a lot about this one, even though I've had it 2 years. So, but there we go. You don't really know someone, do you? Anyway, thanks for watching. Please give us a like. Please subscribe. I kind of like doing this technical kind of thing. Hopefully do some more of these in the future, so let us know if you enjoyed it, and if there's anything I've missed or I should include or do another video about, let me know. And thanks for watching. Ciao for now.